Okay, we go. Okay. Welcome. 8 May, 8th of May. Dis and dat information on the autonomouscollective.net. Discourse, Robinson and rosdowsky. And I probably misspelled it somewhere. Um, Today I'm sort of returning to an idea I've introduced before, probably months ago, on the idea of discourse analysis. Um, it's a thing applied in certain communication analysis and other kinds of language analysis. It covers a bunch of different fields: sociology, sociolinguistics, philosophy, linguistics, and of course, artificial intelligence. And if you follow the chart, critical discourse analysis can be found in after you go through a sort of structural functional linguistics to social semiotics, and then, of course, it remains structural and functional, but also critical CDA here. But all kinds of other things at work: speech act theory, pragmatics, ethnography, etc. Um, Now, the important issue, of course, is that there are several underlying subfields. What is it used for? To identify patterns, recognize recurring themes, language structures, or rhetorical strategies, which is kind of what we're going to look at today, and understand context, explore power dynamics. Some of the methods include content analysis, which are now, computer driven mainly. Critical discourse analysis is sort of fairly obvious, I hope. And then there's the basic sort of conversation analysis, that is, what's going on underneath an interchange in any, conversation. And then narrative analysis and semiotic analysis, which I've yammered about before. So what is CDA, or critical discourse analysis? I'll just read this little bit here. I think that kind of covers the whole business. And you'll see when the examples I use today hopefully provide some version of that anyway, however minor. In CDA, the notion of critical is primarily applied to the engagement with power relations associated with the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. In this, it argues against a realist, neutral, and rationalist view of the world. Instead, the role is to uncloak the hidden power relations largely constructed through language, and to demonstrate and challenge social inequities reinforced and reproduced. And discourse, of course, the the D term in CDA is a contested and contestable term. James G. 1990 uses the term discourse with a small d to talk about language in use, or the way language is used in a social context to enact activities and identities. His work is influenced by Michel Foucault. And analysis, the A part of the CDA takes the view that texts need to be considered in terms of what they include, but also what they omit, that is, what is absent and what is present. Alternative ways of constructing and defining the world. And of course, you can see rhetorically that a better world, as the socialists say, is we can dream and believe and build for a better world. Alternative ways of constructing and defining the world. The critical discourse analyst's job is not to simply read political and social ideologies onto a text, but to consider the myriad ways in which a text could have been written and what these alternatives imply for ways of representing the world, understanding the world, and the social actions that are determined by these ways of thinking and being. And this goes back to ordinary language philosophy and a whole bunch of other things. So this, it's a symptom of sort of 20th century and post-war language analysis, but and has been around for a while. So what I've chosen today is the book, a book by Rosdowsky on the making of Marx. It's an important book from the 60s, but it's the one that kind of gets people into reading some of the 60s and 70s. It kind of impels people to look at the Grundrisse. We've talked about this before, that the Grundrisse is a kind of rough draft, a foundational text, and we've looked at a little bit of it. We probably will return to it at some moment. But the point of looking at the Grundrisse, like looking at the 1844 philosophical and economic manuscripts, is to get a sense of other issues that go on in terms of Marx. And so there is this text, The Making of Marx's Capital, which is a formative text from the 60s and 70s. And yes, it's a book that's translated into English, so it has all these other issues that occur from translation. But I've chosen one chapter that is not the chapter discussed by Raya Donskaya, who writes the second article today. The second article today is a article that see what we're going to do is so we're going to look at two articles today and they compare, or one is a commentary not so much on the specific piece I chose, but in fact she picks other things in the same text. So we're looking at Roman Rosdowsky's The Making of Marx's Capital, and the article by Raya Donskaya is Rudolsky's Methodology and the Missing Dialectic. And and they're both short. One is a chapter, but it's a kind of shortish chapter, and there's an article, and versus Rudolsky gives up on dialectic, which is, kind of taboo, we could say, but he doesn't really. I just think he's looking at a certain set of issues, and it could be problematic, probably isn't. But anyway, that's our little lesson today is to take two articles and do a comparative analysis, but one that doesn't necessarily talk about the same identical thing, but rather different angles on a similar idea. Let's put it that way. And from that, hopefully, we get something more meaningful and without getting too dialectical, as they say. So that's what today's little deal is about. So I will begin. It's chapter 33 in The Making of Capital, and it's by Joan Robinson, who for some people should have been, along with Rosa Luxemburg, holders of the Nobel Prize, to be the first women to get the Nobel Prize, at least in economics. Oh, yes, I know there isn't really a Nobel Prize in economics, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so this is Rudolsky talking about Joan Robinson's critique of Marx. So you can see there's a lot of meta going on. It's often been stated that the differences between the two opposed schools of political economy, the academic and the Marxist, have grown so large that the adherents of one school can scarcely understand the language of the other. See, already we have a discourse issue. A striking example of this gulf is provided by Joan Robinson. This distinguished economist was anxious to do justice to the rough and gloomy grandeur of Marx's theoretical system. In fact, she succeeded in doing nothing more than producing a further caricature of Marxism, and we have plenty of those. I mean, after all, Trump talks about Marxism and he's clueless. I mean, truly clueless if you asked him what it was about. The reason for this does not, of course, lie in some kind of individual failing. That is, Joan Robinson is an excellent economist. It lies deeper than this in the method with which she approached her task. It's obvious that a critic of Marx who admits to having little regard for Marx's method and who dismisses it as Hegelian stuff and nonsense must necessarily misunderstand and misinterpret even its most elementary principles. She might perhaps understand what Marx said literally, but never what he really meant. Naturally, uh, Marx's theory of value, part one. The main target of Robinson's criticism is Marx's theory of value, since if she succeeds in demolishing this cornerstone of Marx's system, the basic assumptions of so-called academic theory can remain intact and be used to yield some kind of quasi-socialist conclusions. Now, the result would be the creation of a neatly pruned, Fabianized, as in Fabian socialism, and Keynesianized Marx, which is kind of what some people have done in terms of post-Keynesianism. I mean, that's not mentioned here, but the implication, I think, is moderately obvious. So, section one, Marx as a value fetishist. Let us start with a few remarks on Robinson's critical method. In common with so many of her predecessors, she divided Marx into two different, in fact, opposed beings. The Hegelian metaphysician of volume one of Capital, and the Marx who was governed by common sense in volume three. What the latter wrote, that is, volume three, could to some extent be reconciled with reality, especially if corrected from the standpoint of quote unquote modern economics. This is because basically the theory of value as set out in volume three is everyone's theory, in contrast to the theory of absolute value in volume one, which is pure dogmatism, quote unquote, and therefore simply indigestible. Let us therefore begin with this indigestible part. Robinson writes, Ricardo sought to find in labor cost a measure of value which would be invariable in the same manner as a measure of length or of weight. Marx, though he did not read Ricardo's essay, Absolute Value and Exchangeable Value, echoes the same thought when he looks for the something, quote unquote, in common between commodities of equal exchange value, which cannot be a geometrical, physical, chemical, or other natural property of commodities. He regarded value as a characteristic inherent to those commodities, as weight or color. This concept of value, continues Robinson, is essentially pre-Marxist and is in glaring contradiction to the fundamentalist principles of Marxist doctrine. For one of Marx's greatest contributions to analysis is the distinction between the forces of production and the relations of production. That is, between the technical relations of man with his physical environment and the economic relations of a man with his neighbors in society, and the notion of the fetishism which attaches itself to exchangeable commodities. That is, commodities arising out of relationships between people, among people, appearing as relations between things. But it takes the author of an original idea a long time to see all its implications. There are many examples of pre-Keynesian thought in the general theory. Hardly surprising, then, that Marx overlooked the simple fact that, quote, weight and length are technical. Value, on the other hand, is social. Robinson Crusoe provides a touchstone for the distinction. Weight and length had the same meaning for him on his little island as at home. Purchasing power had no meaning at all. That is, Robinson Crusoe's island was a marketless culture. The task facing Marx's critic is then one of, at long last, freeing Marx's theory from this terrible inconsistency. This, then, is Joan Robinson's view. Her entire argument can be reduced to two simple statements. Number one, to say that value is something inherent in the commodity is to regard value as a technical category. And number two, to say that labor is the essence of value is to see in the cost of labor, quote, the invariable measure of value, unquote. Now, both assertions are based on trivial misunderstandings. As we've just seen, Marx asserted that the common element which determined the value of commodities could not be a geometrical, physical, chemical, or other natural property of commodities. Now, but what else can it be? Is it their common social nature, which we repeatedly read about in Marx? No, explains Joan Robinson. This is where you make your mistake. Since what is common to commodities must be inherent in them, and further, what is in them can only be of a material and not of a social nature. Thus, only two solutions are possible. Either value is a social phenomenon, in which case it cannot be simultaneously an inherent characteristic of commodities, or it is, in fact, inherent in them, in which case it must be characterized as analogous to weight and color, i.e., as a natural attribute. So we're talking about the difference between a social thing or a natural attribute. And isn't it therefore obvious that Marx simply confused value, which clearly represents a social relation, with a natural or technical category, and thus himself became a victim of the quote unquote commodity fetishism described so admirably in his book? Well, of course, nothing is more agreeable than to see an academic economist standing up so energetically for the exclusive social character of the concept of value. How this is compatible with the dominant role of utility in modern economics is quite another question. That's actually a major question. However, is it not rather foolish to raise this in relation to Marx, who was the first to recognize the preeminently social character of value, and who made this the cornerstone of his entire system? Now, he writes in his principal work, quote, however, let us remember that commodities possess an objective character as values only insofar as they are all expressions of an identical social substance, that is, human labor, right? Labor theory of value. Quote, as crystals of this social substance which is common to them all, they are values dash commodity values. For the commodity form and the value relation of the products of labor have absolutely no connection with the physical nature of the commodity and the material relations arising out of this. It's nothing but the definite social relation between men themselves, which assumes here, for them, the fantastic form of a relation between things. And Marx adds, as if anticipating the kind of criticism his theory might encounter in the future, quote, just as the body of the iron as a measure of weight represents weight alone in relation to the sugar loaf, so in our expression of value, the body of the coat represents value alone, as in contrast to linen. Here, however, the analogy ceases. In the expression of the weight of the sugar loaf, the iron represents a natural property common to both bodies, their weight. But in the expression of value of the linen, the coat represents a supra-natural property, that is, their value, which is something purely social. Except when you put clothes on your pets, for example. Marx makes the distinction between the weight relation of the two bodies, and the value relation of the two commodities absolutely clear here. The former is a material relation, the latter a purely social one. However, this did not prevent his Keynesian critic from imputing exactly the opposite view to him, that is, the concept of value as a quality analogous to weight or color, and on top of that, to lecture him on the distinction between the technical and the social, two concepts which must have been clear even to Robinson Crusoe, although the poor man was never a professor of economics, thank goodness. But how could Joan Robinson arrive at such grotesque conclusions? The explanation clearly has to be looked for in the field of methodology. Now, Marx asks, how can we designate labor as the substance of value if, in actual fact, each concrete labor serves a different aim and is performed by different individuals of differing ability, skill, etc.? How can the infinite variety of the different kinds of professional and individual labor be reduced to a common denominator? His answer is that it is possible. Quote, however varied the useful kinds of labor or productive activities, it is a physiological fact that they are functions of the human organism, and that each such function, whatever may be its nature or its form, is essentially the expenditure of human brain, nerves, muscle, etc., and sense organs. Now, in this sense, the physiological similarity of human labor is a necessary precondition for any value relation, but only a precondition. it would be mistaken to regard the physiological concept of labor as the essence of Marx's theory of value, as many of his critics do. If such an interpretation were correct, there would be, in fact, no fundamental difference between Marx's and Ricardo's versions of the labor theory of value, and the theory itself would be open to serious criticism. In the first place, we'd have to regard value as a supra-historical category looked at physiologically, since in all economic systems, labor looked at physiologically is only an expenditure of human brain, nerves, muscles, and sense organs, unquote. The essentially historical character of the basic economic categories on which Marx laid so much stress would be obscured. And in the second place, we would be compelled, or at least tempted, to look for a mechanical measure of physiological labor, which would, of course, be a fruitless undertaking. Moreover, we would then really confuse the social with the technical, as Joan Robinson thinks. But in fact, however, we have only seen the first part of Marx's solution to the problem so far, since although labor can be reduced physiologically to the simple expenditure of labor power in any society, such a reduction is only necessary in practice and actually takes place at a particular stage of historical development. This only occurs in a society of commodity owners, where exchange constitutes the sole economic connection between individuals, and consequently, where commodities are to be regarded as products of average, undifferentiated labor, without regard to the form of its expenditure. Now, however, this requires no mechanical measure of the physiological expenditure of labor power, since it's society itself, the spontaneous social process behind the backs of the producers, which equates the various forms of labor on the market and reduces them to average, socially necessary labor. On the other hand, the equality of human labor in such a society obtains a material form and the equal objectivity of the products of labor as values. And only in such a society does a definite social relation between men assume the fantastic form of a relation between things. Now, what conclusions can be drawn from this short resume of Marx's theory of value? Clearly, that it's impossible to recognize the exclusively social significance of value unless it is regarded as a historical phenomenon, and that it is equally impossible to deny the historical character of value without seeing in it a quality analogous to weight or color, i.e., a technical category. Now, this provides the explanation as to why Marx's theory has been so often misinterpreted by his critics. Incapable of grasping the essentially historical character of economic categories, they simply deduce, well, if there's such a thing as value, then it must be a physical or natural quality of commodities. Now, in this way, it is not Marx they criticize, but their own narrowly naturalistic conception. But what about Joan Robinson's second assertion, her picture of Marx as a seeker for an invariable measure of value? Now, once more, this shows a crassly naturalistic interpretation of Marx's theory. The first interpreters of the capitalist system, the mercantilists, asked the question, how can the wealth of a nation be reliably measured? Simply by gold and silver? And that's a belief that still exists. But the value of gold and silver is itself subject to variation, and a variable measure cannot be an exact measure. So, to give an historical example, the ancient Germans took as a measure of land the area which an average peasant could plow in one day. Now, this is certainly a very imperfect measure, and since then, this deficiency has been overcome by the modern technique of surveying. At least you get the size of land. Why couldn't political economy accomplish something similar? It is hardly surprising that William Petty went in search unsuccessfully for a natural par between land and labor, so as might express the value of all commodities by either of them alone, as well as or better than by both, and reduce one into the other as easily as we reduce pence into pounds. And Adam Smith expressed the same idea when he wrote, quote, gold and silver vary in their value, are sometimes cheaper and sometimes dearer, sometimes of easier and sometimes of more difficult purchase. But as a measure of quantity, such as the natural foot fathom or handful, which is continually varying in its own quantity, can never be an accurate measure of the quantity of other things, So a commodity, which is itself continually varying in its own value, can never be an accurate measure of the value of other commodities. That goes all the way up to Srafa, right? But can an extraordinary commodity of invariable value be found? What you're trying to do is find some norm, right? Smith was convinced that he had found such a charm. In his view, the quite ordinary commodity labor, quote unquote, could successfully be employed as an invariable standard. Now, of course, the wages paid to workers are usually very different. However, equal quantities of labor at all times and places may be said to be of equal value to the laborer. In his ordinary state of health, strength, and spirits, he must always lay down the same portion of his ease, his liberty, and his happiness. The price which he pays must always be the same, whatever may be the quantity of goods which he receives in return of it. Now, of these, indeed, it may sometimes purchase a greater and sometimes a smaller quantity, but it is their value which varies, not that of the labor which purchases them. Labor alone, therefore, never varying in its own value, is alone the ultimate and real standard by which the value of all commodities can at times and places be estimated and compared. It is their real price. Money is their nominal price only. So the whole idea here is that, money helps you sort of figure out some sort of standard. So price might be a standard, wages might be a standard. Well, silly us. So much then on the historical origins of the concept of the invariable measure of value. It's clear that this insoluble problem, Marx compared it with squaring the circle, only occupied the theorists as long as they regarded value as an eternal natural quality of commodities. Now, the problem is solved, however, as soon as this standpoint is abandoned. Now, this is not the place to deal with Ricardo's conclusive critique of Smith's fallacy. However, one point should be stressed. Whenever Ricardo spoke about the desirability of the so-called invariable measure of value, he did not mean labor costs. That is the commodity labor, which Smith meant, but rather labor as such, as value-creating activity itself, which is, of course, quite a different matter. So ultimately, we're seeing the difference between labor and labor power. However, what does this have to do with Marx and his theory of value? Can we really find traces of his writings which indicate that he might have looked for an invariable measure of value, as was certainly the case when Smith, Malthus, or Distructic Tracy? Let us read what Marx himself wrote on this question. In order to measure the value of commodities, to establish an external measure of value, it is not necessary that the value of the commodity in terms of which the other commodities are measured should be invariable. It must, on the contrary, be variable, as I have shown in the first part, because the measure of value is and must be a commodity, since otherwise it would have no immanent measure in common with other commodities. So this idea of immanence is really important. This is carrying over Hegelian and Kantian kind of questions, which is all part of that thing we were yammering about before about sublation, etc. If, for example, the value of money changes, it changes to an equal degree in relation to all of the other commodities. Their relative values are therefore expressed in it, just as correctly as if the value of money had remained unchanged. The problem of finding an invariable measure of value is thereby eliminated. This quotation comes from an extensive discussion on the problem of the invariable measure of value in Marx's theories of surplus value. Note that that's what we look at on Saturdays. But perhaps Joan Robinson didn't consider the theories of surplus value. Nevertheless, she could have found the same ideas in Marx's contribution, that is, the contribution to the critique of political economy, blah, 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 and in Capital. These are, the earlier version that precedes Capital. For example, in the contribution text, quote, gold must be in principle a variable value if it is to serve as a measure of value, because only as reification of labor time can it become the equivalent of other commodities. But as a result of changes in the productivity of concrete labor, the same amount of labor time is embodied in unequal volumes of the same type of use values. And we can read in Capital, quote, but gold can serve as a measure of value only because it is itself a product of labor and therefore potentially variable in value. You got to go out and dig that stuff up for the most part. I mean, even panning for gold requires labor, right? These few quotations are sufficient to show Marx's real view on the subject, and if it happens to be the case that occasional remarks in Ricardo's works could be interpreted to fit in with Joan Robinson's view, that is, remarks which in no way belong to the essence of the theory of value, then exactly the opposite applies to Marx. Not only did he not share Smith's illusions about an invariable measure of value, he even devoted numerous pages in his theories to an emphatic refutation of this misunderstanding. However, in contrast with so many of his critics, Marx took care not to treat his predecessors as simpletons or small children. Oh, yeah, sure. But rather showed that even mistakes were necessary steps on the path to the discovery of scientific truth, and that hidden behind the conception of an invariable measure of value lay a very serious and well-founded desire to make the concept of value an objective one. Now, this does not mean to say that it is quantitative or even qualitative in that sense. It is objective, which not quite the same. Joan Robinson could have learned a lot from these pages. She would have found that she had already had a predecessor 140 years ago in the shape of Bailey, who similarly confused the idea of an invariable measure of value with the concept of value as an objective social quality of commodities, with labor as its inherent standard of measurement. She would certainly not have then characterized herself characterized Marx as a commodity fetishist. But didn't Marx once complain to Engels about his critics? If only these people would take at least the trouble to read what I wrote properly. Section 2, Marx's rigmarole. Up until now, we've been concerned with the labor theory of value as it is presented in Volume 1 of Capital. And yes, most people read that, and we're reading it on Sundays. However, Joan Robinson, in common with many much earlier critics of Marx, asserts that there is an irreconcilable contradiction between the labor theory of value in Volume 1 and the theory of prices of production in Volume 3. Now, as soon as she discusses the contradiction, she abandons her even temper. Now, what was all the fuss about, she asks contemptuously, in relation to previous debates on the subject? How could Hilferding, Sweezy, and other Marxists overlook the fact that Marx's attempt at a reconciliation of the two theories is purely formalistic and consists in juggling to and fro with averages and totals, and that everything which Marx wrote on this is a rigmarole entirely devoid of content? Now, these are serious words, but what real content do they have? To put it plainly, very little. Let us examine Joan Robinson's own words. Quote, at first, Marx states dogmatically that commodities tend to exchange at prices which correspond to their values. However, in a system in which prices correspond to values, the net product of equal quantities of labor is sold for equal quantities of money. Thus, given uniform money wage rates, surplus in terms of money per unit of labor is everywhere equal. To say that relative prices correspond to relative values is the same thing as to say that the rate of exploitation is the same in all industries, which can't. But if capital per man employed, that is the organic composition of capital, is different in different industries, while profit per man, that is the rate of exploitation, is the same, profit per unit of capital must vary inversely with capital per man. It would be possible for both the rate of profit and the rate of exploitation to be equal in all industries only if the ratio of capital to labor employed were also equal. So, it's kind of circular in that sense. She continues, in Volume 1, Marx leaves this question open. In Volume 3, he shows that capital per man varies with technical conditions, while competition between capitalists tends to establish a uniform rate of profit. The rate of exploitation, therefore, cannot be uniform, and relative prices do not correspond to values. On the contrary, the prices of the commodities differ from their values in such a way as to make the rates of exploitation actually enjoyed by the capitalists in the different industries vary with the organic composition of their capitals. Marx thus entangled himself in an artificial difficulty by starting from the assumption of a uniform rate of exploitation. There is no warrant for this assumption. If wages are equal in all industries, surplus per man employed, that is, the rate of exploitation, varies with the net productivity per man employed, and in general, productivity per man is greater where capital per man is greater. In Marx's own words, quote, the prevailing degree of productive power shows itself in the relative preponderance of the constant over the variable capital. If the capital in a certain sphere of production is of a higher composition than the average, then it expresses a development of the productive power above the average. Unquote. Thus, the rate of exploitation tends to vary with capital per man employed. The very same process which produces an equal rate of profit between industries produces unequal rates of exploitation. As I see it, Robinson concludes, the conflict between Volume 1 and Volume 2 is a conflict between mysticism and common sense. In Volume 3, common sense triumphs, but still must pay lip service to mysticism in its verbal formulations. This quote goes very far, unquote. Now, the entire argument can be dealt with as follows. Marx never maintained that to say that relative prices correspond to relative values means the same as to say that the rate of exploitation is the same in all industries. Neither can such a conclusion be drawn from his theory. This is for one simple reason. Joan Robinson was, of course, right to say that according to the labor theory of value, equal amounts of average, socially necessary labor are exchanged for equal amounts of labor. That is, 8 hours labor for 8 hours labor, 1 working day for 1 working day. But it does not follow from this that the division of the working day into necessary labor and surplus labor must be the same everywhere. In one case, the worker might work perhaps 5 hours for himself and only 3 hours for the employer. In another case, this might be the reverse. But haven't we smuggled in the assumption of uniform wages? Now, this would not improve the matter. Wages may be equal in each of the factories, but the length of the working day with equal hourly wages or the intensity of labor can be different. Equal amounts of labor would be exchanged in both cases, and if the organic composition of capital in both plants is the same as, as the average organic composition of the total social capital, then these values will correspond to prices. Now, but the rates of exploitation could well be different in contrast to Joan Robinson's assertion. In other words, labor time as a measure of value is in no way dependent on equal rates of exploitation. And it is amazing, to put it mildly, to see Marx's or Ricardo's theory of value interpreted in such a way. Number two, on the other hand, Marx never said that because competition leads to the formation of a general rate of profit, the rates of exploitation in different industries cannot be uniform. And he similarly never confused the rate of exploitation, i.e. the rate of surplus value, with profits per worker, which the capitalists actually enjoy. That is, i.e., after the originally different rates of profit in different industries have been equalized into a uniform rate of profit. What he actually maintained is the exact opposite. That is, because equal numbers of workers who employed in industries with differing organic compositions of capital, with other conditions being the same working time, intensity of labor, etc., produce the same amounts of surplus value. A transformation of values into quote-unquote production prices must take place if an average rate of profit is to prevail. Now, the difference is obvious. Well, maybe yes or maybe no, but hopefully you can see that there is a difference between the way in which you frame both of these. Number three, Marx never maintained that the rate of exploitation would vary with the amount of capital per worker employed. In other words, that the size of the surplus value produced is a function of the constant capital employed. That's silly, because you wouldn't be able to defend a labor theory of value on that basis. Such an assertion would have been utterly nonsensical to him. The relative predominance of the constant part of capital over the variable part of capital certainly means a growth in the productivity of labor. More commodities, more use values can be produced, but that in no way signifies that somehow the workers in industries which employ a larger amount of constant capital, more tech, automatically create more surplus value. An increase in the rate of surplus value through increased productivity can only be achieved if the industries producing the means of subsistence are able to supply cheaper consumer goods for the workers, and if the necessary part of the working day is thereby reduced. So it's Department 1 and Department 2. But this affects all workers in all industries. Indeed, it would require a lively imagination to ascribe such a productivity theory of surplus value to Karl Marx. But people do. We see then that it was not Marx himself, but Joan Robinson who entangled him in an artificial difficulty by imputing three axioms to him which correspond to nothing in his theory. And this is, the fault of many critics of Marx. And it is she, too, who provides him with an easy solution to the difficulty by introducing the only too well-known value-creating power of capital. Just imagine, Marx was perfectly conscious of the solution, yet he still expended years of time and effort to construct the complicated rigmarole in Volume 3. What a stubborn Hegelian metaphysician he must have been. Obviously, he's being sarcastic here. And the point, of course, is that, Volume 1 is complete and published, and Volumes 2 and 3 were, kind of put together, a rigmarole. Section 3, Marx's search for a social elixir, the problem of value in a socialist society. So much then on Marx's theory of value. Finally, however, we're offered some consolation, although, according to Joan Robinson, common sense compelled Marx to admit that the law of value does not function correctly under capitalism. He did, however, note that the footnote is a really large footnote, and you might want to read that to see how Marx comes out. However, believe that at least under socialism, the labor theory of value would come into its own. In other words, he was clearly a utopian socialist for whom the labor theory of value did not so much represent the result of pure scientific analysis as rather an artifice to bring about an ideal system of pricing, and in so doing, secure the realization of a just world. No wonder that Joan Robinson devotes a particular chapter of her book to Marx's alleged views on the problem of value in socialist society, and primarily to his supposed postulate that in a rational economic system, prices should be made to correspond to values. And further, that she honestly thinks she has discovered the substantial meaning of Marx's theory, and the quantity of a commodity may contain more than the social labor required for its production. And from this point of view, the market value of this entire commodity represents only necessary labor. But if this commodity had been produced in excess of the existing social needs, then so much of the social labor time is squandered. And the mass of the commodity comes to represent a much smaller quantity of social labor time in the market than is actually incorporated in it. Now, it is only where production is under the actual predetermining control of society that the latter establishes a relation between the volume of social labor time applied in producing definite articles and the volume of the social want to be satisfied by these articles. Now, for this reason, these commodities must be sold below their market value, and a portion of them may be even altogether unsaleable. The reverse applies if the quantity of social labor employed in the production of a certain kind of commodity is too small to meet the social demand for that commodity. But if the quantity of social demand for that article, then the article is sold at its market value. The exchange or sale of commodity at their value is the rational state of affairs, i.e., the natural law of their equilibrium. It is this law that explains the deviations, and not vice versa, the deviations that explain the law. We can see the entire section is concerned with capitalist society, with the exception of the sentences and brackets in which Marx expresses the view that the future socialist society will not squander the labor time of its members as capitalist society does. Now, but this does not prevent Joan Robinson from attributing Marx with the view that the sale of commodities at their values will also be the natural law under socialism. So anyway, I read a huge footnote there. So no wonder that Robinson devotes a particular chapter of her book to Marx's alleged view on the problem of value in socialist society, and primarily to the supposed postulate that in a rational economic system, prices should be made to correspond to values, and further that she honestly thinks that she's discovered the substantial meaning of Marx's theory in this fantasy, Shades of Proudhon. One could perhaps take all this seriously if at least it bore some resemblance to the theory under discussion, but Marx never tired of attacking both Proudhon and all the other utopians who wanted to turn the world upside down by means of a specially constructed, quote unquote, just system of exchange. He repeatedly and emphatically stated that value is an historical category, a particular mode of expression of the social function of labor in a society of commodity owners, and consequently, it must disappear in a socialist society. This is the whole point: is that some things will disappear, i.e., wither away. Thus, in the Critique of the Gothic program, he wrote, within the cooperative society, based on common ownership of the means of production, the producers do not exchange their products. Just as little does the labor employed on the products appear here as the value of these products, as a material quality possessed by them. Since now, in contrast to capitalist society, individual labor no longer exists in an indirect fashion, but directly as a component part of the total labor. And in capital, the product of labor is an object of utility in all states of society, but it is only a historically specific epoch of development which presents the labor expended in the production of a useful article as an objective, quote unquote, property of that article, i.e., as its value. In fact, something which is only valid for the particular form of production, the production of commodities, namely the fact that the specific social character of private labors carries on independently, assumes in the product the form of the existence of values, appears to be just as ultimately valid as the fact that the scientific dissection of the air into its component parts, hydrogen and oxygen, left the atmosphere itself unaltered in its physical configuration. Chemtrails. No, not really. This explains why bourgeois political economy has never once asked the question why labor is expressed in value, and why the measurement of labor by its duration is expressed in magnitude of the value of the product. These formulas, which bear the unmistakable stamp of belonging to a social formation in which the process of production has mastery over man, instead of the opposite, appear to the political economist bourgeois consciousness to be as much a self-evident and nature-imposed necessity as productive labor itself. It's hardly surprising, then, that already during his own lifetime, a number of bourgeois academics tried to attribute Marx with this very same view that we've encountered in Joan Robinson's critique, and that he, in turn, Marx, felt obliged to explain that in the course of his investigation of value, he was concerned only with bourgeois relations, not with the application of the theory of value to a social state which Herr Schaffel has constructed for me. However, the reader can be certain that the late Austrian professor Schaffel would not have been a match for Joan Robinson, for in the final analysis, he only succeeded in constructing a social state for Marx, whereas Joan Robinson not only created an ideal pricing system, but also held out the prospect for private saving in a socialist economy. Even, in fact, a socialist income tax and profit tax. Now, this is the issue that some people have with John Romer. But what is one supposed to do with a Keynesian critic who, with unbelievable naivete, turns Marx into a traditional Proudhonist and does not even realize that for Marx, value, like nearly all of his economic categories, represents not a natural, but an exclusively historical category, and that, consequently, Marx never attempted to put together some kind of recipe for the socialist kitchen of the future. That phrase is an interesting phrase. It comes up elsewhere. Anyway, part two, Marx's theory of the essence of capitalist exploitation and his concept of capital. Up till now, we've simply been concerned with Robinson's attack on the basis of Marx's theoretical system, his theory of value. However, one must be consistent. If we abandon the concept of value, we can no longer retain the concept of surplus value. With this, we not only destroy the basis, but also the cornerstone of this system, and all the categories of Marxist economics must either be abandoned or totally revised. This even applies to the apparently simple concept of the quote-unquote rate of exploitation, as the ratio S to V is clearly conceived as a value relation. So what's left of Marx's entire system? Now, what's left, in fact, What remains is the general idea of exploitation and surplus labor as distinct from surplus value. Now, this is scarcely enough for the likes of us, but Joan Robinson manages brilliantly with it. She asserts that Marx's primitive labor theory of value has proved to be a complete failure. Nevertheless, he used it to express certain ideas about the nature of the capitalist system, and the importance of these ideas in no way depends upon the particular terminology in which he chose to set them forth. Now, what do these ideas actually consist of? Simply that the possibility of exploitation depends on the existence of a margin between total net output and the subsistence minimum of the workers. If a worker can produce no more in a day than he is obliged to eat in a day, he is no potential object of exploitation. This idea is simple and can be expressed in simple language without any apparatus of specialized terminology. And it is precisely these simple and fundamental characteristics of capitalism which were explained by Marx, but which became, quote, lost in the maze of academic economic analysis. We see then that the simple and fundamental characteristic of capitalism consists in the existence of surplus labor. But surplus labor is as old as the history of human civilization. Capital, says Marx, did not invent surplus labor. Wherever a part of society possesses the monopoly of the means of production, the worker, free or unfree, see the implication for slavery, must add to the labor time necessary for his own maintenance an extra quantity of labor time in order to produce the means of subsistence for the owner of the means of production. Whether this proprietor be the Athenian aristocrat, an Etruscan theocrat, a civis Romanus, a Norman baron, or an American slaveholder, a Wallachian boyar, a modern landlord, or capitalist. However, it ought to be obvious that if this is all we know about capitalism, then we know virtually nothing at all, since it's precisely the specific economic form in which unpaid surplus labor is pumped out of the direct producers, which, quote, determines the relationship of rulers and ruled, unquote, and also distinguishes the various historical epochs from one another. This is why we have different modes of production. We read in Engels, quote, surplus labor, labor beyond the time required for the laborer's own maintenance and appropriation by others of the product of this surplus labor, the exploitation of labor is therefore common to all forms of society that have existed hitherto, insofar as these things have moved in class antagonisms. But it is only when the product of this surplus labor assumes the form of surplus value, when the owner of the means of production finds the free laborer free from social fetters and free from possessions of his own as an object of exploitation and exploits him for the purpose of production of commodities. See, this is the difference under capitalism. It is only then, according to Marx, that the means of production assume the specific character of capital. So this is the dependence of capital on commodities. It is clear, therefore, that Marx's analytical apparatus is the only means by which the specifically capitalist mode of exploitation can be understood. That is, employing the categories of value and surplus value. It's hardly surprising, then, that Joan Robinson confined herself to the general and hence totally vague notion of exploitation as such, without trying to analyze the particular features of this specifically capitalist mode of exploitation. This reminds one of Düring, of the text Anti-Düring, who annexed the surplus labor discovered by Marx in order to use it to kill off the surplus value, likewise discovered by Marx, which for the moment did not suit his purpose, and consequently her conclusions are not much better than those by Düring. Now, the best example of this is shown by her treatment of the category of capital. We saw how she accused Marx of not applying his own theory consistently, and how she even imputed a fetishistic concept of value to him. Now, what did she learn from this epoch-making theory herself? Unfortunately, very little. This is because, like Düring, and like all present-day academic economists, she regards capital as a thing, as a mere means of production, and not as a social relation. In her eyes, it is a natural, not a socio-historical category. And this is actually a very big difference. So, it is not surprising that she rebuked Marx for his logic-chopping theorizing in the following way. Quote, Next, Marx uses his analytic apparatus to emphasize the view that only labor is productive. In itself, this is nothing but a verbal point. Land and capital produce no value, for value is the product of labor time. But fertile land and efficient machines embrace the productivity of labor in terms of real output. Whether we choose to say that capital is productive or that capital is necessary to make labor productive is not a matter of much importance. What is important to say that owning capital is not a productive activity. The academic economists, by treating capital as productive, used to insinuate the suggestion that capitalists deserve well by society, perfectly justified in drawing income from their property. See, remember we talked about landed property 2 days ago. In the past, a certain superficial plausibility could be given to this point of view by treating property and enterprise as indistinguishable. Now, but this method of confusing the issue is no longer effective. Nowadays, the divorce between ownership and enterprise is becoming more and more complete. The typical entrepreneur is no longer the bold and tireless businessman of Marshall or the sly and rapacious moneybags of Marx, but a mass of inert shareholders indistinguishable from rentiers who employ salaried managers to run their concerns. Nowadays, therefore, it seems simple to say that owning property is not productive without entering into any logic chopping disputes as to whether land and capital are productive and without erecting a special analytic apparatus in order to make the point. Indeed, a language which compels us to say that capital, as opposed to the ownership of capital, is not productive, rather obscures the issue. It is more cogent to say that capital and the application of science to industry are immensely productive, and that the institutions of private property developing into monopoly are deleterious because they prevent us from having as much capital and the kind of capital that we need. We see here yet again that as soon as Joan Robinson begins to criticize, she unfailingly misses the mark. It follows automatically from the standpoint of Marx's theory that only labor creates value, but that in no way means that in his eyes, the objective factors of production are to be denied any form of productivity. On the contrary, to the extent that these factors raise the level of production, they certainly contribute to the production of use values. However, that is no reason to confuse the categories of use value and value, big V value, as Joan Robinson does. On the other hand, Marx continually stressed that capital, not land, is productive in a different sense as the ruling social relation of the bourgeois mode of production. As we read in the Grundrisse and the theories of surplus value that the great historical mission of capital consists in enforcing surplus labor, this is why capital is productive, i.e., an essential relation for the development of the social productive forces. Now, of course, it does not follow from this that capital adds anything to the value of commodities, and that in this respect, there is no distinction between the activities of the factor capital and the factor labor, as Joan Robinson seems to suppose. On the contrary, the difference is enormous. It's no less great than the difference between the activity of a horse and the activity of the whip, which makes it gallop. However, although capital produced no values, it has produced a particular form of exploitation which is indispensable for the development of the productive forces of a particular historical period. And it was in the position to do this precisely because it was owned and not because it somehow functioned as a means of production or because it furthered the application of science to industry. Its real productivity lies in its insatiable hunger for surplus value. From this perspective, the apparently self-explanatory concept of, and remember, surplus value is not wealth. From this perspective, the apparently self-explanatory concept of productive labor acquires a special meaning, since in capitalist society, the only labor which is productive is that which directly enlarges capital, or as Malthus formulated it, directly increases the wealth of its master. Now, of course, for a vulgar economist, this is all a matter of definition. Here I quote Rosa Luxemburg. But the difference, what's the difference whether we derive the meaning of the word productivity from the relations between person and person or from the relations between people and nature? The vulgar economists never once suspect that the question, what is productivity, has to be looked at historically, and that such a perspective presupposes the use of the dialectical method to which they object so much. However, what about the distinction between capital and the possession of capital, which Joan Robinson places such weight on? Once again, we encounter an old acquaintance, since exactly the same distinction has been the favorite idea of Bray, Gray, Proudhon, and other utopian socialists from the year dot. If the workers are to be free, then capitalism must be destroyed. But this does not mean the destruction of capital, but rather its preservation, wrote Bakunin. Now, Marx could only punish such a dichotomy with contempt. We read in the Grundrisse, that is the rough draft, capital is necessarily the capitalist. Of course, socialists say we need capital, but not the capitalist. Then capital appears as a pure thing, not as a relation of production. And in the theories of surplus value, he wrote that when economists speak of the services which capital performs in the production of use values, they mean nothing other than that products of previous useful work serve anew as means of production, as objects of labor, instruments of labor, and means of subsistence for the workers. But in this sense, the word capital is quite superfluous and meaningless. Wheat is nourishing not because it is capital, but because it's wheat. The use value of wool derives from the fact that it is wool, not capital. In the same way, the action of steam-powered machinery has nothing in common with its existence as capital. It would do the same work if it were not capital, and if it belonged not to the factory owner, but to the workers. An understanding of Marx's particular concept of capital is, of course, a necessary condition of any discussion of his economic theory. So, concluding remarks from Rodowsky, for those who came in late. We've only dealt with the main points of Joan Robinson's critique in this chapter, although she does, in fact, criticize other parts of Marx's system, his theory of wages, the theory of the falling rate of profit, and his theory of crises. Since she does not offer anything new to the Marxist reader, however, and what she does say has already been presented with greater effect by other critics of Marx, there is no reason for further discussion on these subjects, and there is equally little reason to correct every misquoted passage and misunderstanding in her presentation of Marx. On the other hand, a considerable part of her essay is concerned with a discussion of the supposed affinity, now this is important for post-Keynesianism, between Marx's and Keynes's theories, which we consider to be largely imaginary or at least overestimated. Now, since this does not come under the scope of this chapter, we shall confine ourselves to a few concluding remarks. We have shown how little there is to be learned from Joan Robinson's critique of Marx. But is this all there is to be found in her book? Doesn't she constantly stress that, as a rule, the workers are exploited by their employers in present-day society? And doesn't she even attack the capitalist sacred rights of property? She certainly does do this. She even regards her position as one of the special gains of the modern tendency of political economy, although the modern has to be considerably narrowed down to permit such an interpretation. But this doesn't matter. Joan Robinson should not, at least as an individual, be lumped together with the apologist political economists, including Lord Keynes, but should rather count as a representative of a socialist current in present-day bourgeois economics. Now, it is, of course, true that her socialism has its own unique hue, is heavily reliant on crutches borrowed from the pre-Marxist stock of ideas, especially from the godfather of all petty bourgeois socialisms, Proudhon. And this is not a coincidence, as Joan Robinson's socialist conclusions reflect the mood of a relatively broad strata of the rebellious bourgeois intelligentsia of today, the PMC. These strata have lost their belief in the progressive role of the capitalist class. They're deeply disturbed by the antisocial practices of the monopolies and the economic instability of this bedeviled age. And consequently, they set their hopes on a nationalized state capitalist economy, which would curb the threatening economist chaos, bring about a fairer distribution of wealth among the factors of production, and bless us with so much capital and the kind of capital we need. Hence the sudden dissemination of populist Keynesianism as an ideology which reflects this mood in its iridescent diversity. However, this populist Keynesianism has very little to do with the particular doctrines of Keynes and his school. This is the MMT issue, and one should not hold them responsible for it. Nevertheless, as soon as the academic Keynesians leave their own domain and venture onto the so-called ideological terrain, this unique subcurrent of Keynes's economics becomes clearly visible, and we're once more haunted by the ghost of Proudhon. But see now in this light the socialist tendencies in Joan Robinson's writing, which so disturb the late Professor Schumpeter. No longer present anything special or inexplicable. Now, I know that's perhaps too polemic, but Rudolsky has a point to make here, and his point, of course, is one that discriminates between something that is a little bit more analytic and something that clarifies certain abstract terms and to leave certain categories sacrosanct. And that's really important because ultimately, any of these arguments about value, labor theory value at all, are on categorical differences that are important to get sort of straightened away at the front end. Because if you don't have them squared away, you make all kinds of assumptions that you can spend a lot of ink on that and a lot of math, a lot of equations, but it's not going to work properly unless you take a kind of a more critical and a more realist view of the research project. Now, the second article, which I'm not going to read in total, and you can read it yourself because it's largely more polemic, and it sets about the argument that I stated at the beginning today, and was this idea that we can develop critical realist models that triangulate meaning of various texts. And in the Marxist context, we're trying to work through ideas about the dialectic. And this is by no means the perfect answer to this, but it's interesting to compare texts that discuss a central issue, and the central issue in this case is the missing dialectic that Donetskaya uh, comments on in Rudolsky's methodology. Now, the point, of course, is that this dialectic is missing because it's in Rudolsky's work, his major work on the making of Marx's Capital, is more a discussion on the earlier text, the Grundrisse, whereupon dialectic is not, kind of fully worked through, and clearly a dialectical materialist, a version which comes up in a subsequent Marxian configuration, is not quite all there. And recall, of course, that Marx changes his mind at various points. There's a difference between the Marx of the early or mid 1850s and the Marx of a decade later. And everyone agrees on that. So there's nothing controversial. It's just that some people forget that these little milestones occur in the lives. So anyway, Donetskaya comments on these matters, particularly framing it in terms of Stalin. And so you can read this for yourself. Among non-Stalinists but leadership-conscious Marxists, there's hardly a work that has gained the acclaim according to Rudolsky's The Making of Marx's Capital, published in Germany in 1968. Remember, that's an important year. It has now been brought out by Pluto Press, etc. If not a classic, it is, after all, about the only available, this is writing a while ago, serious commentary on Marx's Grundrisse, which has only been recently published in English for the first time. And, she's essentially fairly critical of all these things, but the idea here is she just can't find the dialectic in Rudolsky's text. Now, it wasn't so available in the chapter I just read on Joan Robinson, and I agree with her that there is a lot of missing dialectic there, because I think you can argue the dialectical point in the text above. It's just not mentioned. And yes, you can argue, well, it's just hidden or something. Well, yeah, it could be that too. I think we'd have to raise the question of whether it's already implied, because by the time we get to chapter 33, I think there's certainly enough dialectic in there. But that's just me. And there's a lot of pages, a lot of ink being spilled. But what is new in Rudolsky is the claim that it was not done methodologically. That talking about Luxemburg, that her error in grappling with the problems in Volume 2 of Capital was that she underestimated the so-called Hegelian inheritance in Marx's thought. So her attack is not so much on Rudolsky, but on Rosa Luxemburg. So that's a whole nother set. There's a couple of side moves in this article. Now, Rudolsky puts mystification of things on a par with reification of labor. And so she's attacking this whole business about, and I don't think that you should just sort of, dismiss it out of hand on the issues of reification and commodity fetishism or, whatever. Marx does the exact opposite, demonstrating that the reason why the perversion of subject to object assumes that form is due to the fact that in the process of production, that it, that is what production relations really are. Laborers are mere appendages to machines. And it is this set of relations that is to define the differences between Department One and Department Two, and that the goal, even in the context, whether you include Department One or Department and or Department Two, it's still about the goal, which is mentioned above by Rudolsky as the goal is surplus value. It's not all the other intermediary things. It's really more about surplus value. Now, they call it profit, but it's not really profit. It's something else. And because it has a relational element to concepts of wealth, that's why it's more complicated, because they're all different kinds of the way in which we can talk about surplus value that are not identical to wealth. But anyway, so she goes through here. It's a question of the actual revision of Marx's view that the law of value is the motivating force of capitalism, which actually agrees with Rudolsky way, way up there. The idea that capitalism is different. I mean, it's just different. It's a mode of production. It has these additional abstract elements that operate differently than in prior modes of production. And it's there. And that the commodity is a way of getting at the problem, is to see it as this mobile problem that deflects into a multiplicity of forms. Now, she says, well, it's clear by then they'd thrown out what had previously followed commodity and money, history of the theory of each category, all of which had been relegated to volume 4. You see, that's the issue of the volume 4, that is the theories of surplus value, is that he kept on moving things forward, that ultimately at some point there's this catch basin which has all these things, a sump, as it were, for surplus value. And so, and then she does a thing in here on, let me read this last bit here. The fetishism of commodities has since become not only one of the most famous of Marx's writings, but so bothersome to all exploitative state powers, especially those calling them so socialist, that evidently they just cannot live with it. What Stalin declared necessary for the teaching, since has been codified without any acknowledgement, such as they had to make in 1943, when it flew in the face of all previous teaching by friend and foe alike. And this overlaps with Kautsky and a bunch of other things. Discarding or making an abstraction of the concrete imperative freely associated labor, taking destiny into its own hands, stripping away the fetishism of commodities, of plan, that is the new economic plan, etc., of anything and everything non-human, and declaring with Marx, human power is its own end, inexorably leads one to tail-end Stalinism, that is to say, state capitalist methodology. Justice Oscar Long's methodology was pragmatic, Stalinist, eclectic, so was Rudolsky's. Despite all talk of dialectic and relationship of Marx to Hegel, Rudolsky, by no accident whatever, concluded that one need no longer bite into the sour apple, study the whole of Hegel's logic in order to understand Marx's Capital. One can arrive at the same end directly by studying the Grundrisse, the rough draft. Now, too bad that all Rudolsky arrived at by the end of his study of the Grundrisse was the quagmire of Polish neo-Stalinism, which Rudolsky calls neo-Marxism. Thus does the dialectic wreak its vengeance on the non-Stalinist pragmatists who skip over Marx's admonition that the Hegelian dialectic is the source of all dialectic, as well as Lenin's conclusion that it is indeed impossible to understand Marx's Capital, especially his first chapter, without studying the whole of Hegel's logic, which is a huge barrier once you start reading Hegel. So anyway, I get to the end of this. Let's see if there are any comments. What I've looked at today is an article by Raya Danayevskaya on Rudolsky, who writes a chapter in his magnum opus, the Making of Marx's Capital, which was a major text in the 1960s, which really is one of the key texts to an entire trend toward rereading the Grundrisse, well, it wasn't available in English for a long time. So there's Western Marxism moved in this direction partially because of Rosdowsky. And my point is to be able to compare the two texts, to look at what is the central method and methodology that's necessary. In this case, it is to rework or rethink the questions of dialectic, which is not problematic at all. One should have a good handle on it one way or the other. It doesn't mean that you have to become a Hegelian, scholar, because it's tough sledding, believe me. Particularly, people don't read German. It's just, and I'm just paraphrasing David Harvey there. So anyway, and I'm at the end of and I went over my time, but not too much. We'll get back to regular matters. Let's see if there's any commentary. No, there's no commentary. Fetish or delusion. Um, Making the concept of value an objective one seems impossible. Well, it's not making it an object, but things can be objective. Um, um, it doesn't mean that it's normative. It just objectivity is different. It's not analytic necessarily, but it is not subjective in that sense. A conversation about lapis lazuli, and at one time in Italy, was considered more valuable than diamonds. Well, the issue of lapis lazuli is a scarcity question in terms of pure lapis lazuli, but substitutes are what emerges given the emergence of mercantile culture and alternatives in getting the color. It's a valuable color. I mean, clearly, and built on absence and it's a really wonderful color. But as long as people fetishize things, can there be objectivity? I would assert to you that particularly in painting, the construction of things that replicate lapis lazuli, and I would assert that that's one of the reasons why doing it within the context, this is sort of the heritage of Apelles, is that to be able to replicate it within the context of painting under the rules of painting, one needs to sort of work through what that means, and that creating it in a realist context offsets its absence in reality. You don't need lapis lazuli and what's it, indigo, to make those kind of things. You can get things that replicate that, which is ultimately due to the theoretical material skill of artists. And objective is not, yes, no, objective is not analytic. I mean, analytic is a way of talking objectively, but analytic is not pure. I mean, it's never pure. I mean, well, this is Kant, but these kinds of ideas have to be, you have to sort of see, well, one is embedded more in the other. And things that are analytic as opposed to synthetic. You see, the fact that you have analytic and synthetic categories is a whole another set of questions that is not identical to concrete and abstract. And you want to sort of figure out, well, what's the difference between this kind of division? But it's an important division, and it is in the working it out that is important. Oh yes, Larry, it is like sublation. That's exactly the reason why you do it. This is exactly why one needs to read both Hegel and Kant on these things, and not because it's just it's all seems very like a technical discourse, but it allows us to have more latitude, because that's the problem in the discourse problem that exists with the two texts that I chose today, is that you if you sort of overdetermine certain ideas, you wind up in this kind of, you get into these weird dead ends or escape roads or something, and they're not very fruitful, because it'll take you down a decade of not so useful reading, and that's kind of what the project of reading is. Okay, well, I got to the end, and yes, I was yammering for too long there. I wasted more time. Here we go. I'm going to terminate the live stream. Thank you very much.